Welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, the show that remembers the good and sometimes the not so good old days of parenting past. I'm your host, Samantha Kemp-Jackson from the Multiple Mayhem Mama blog, and every week we'll be talking about how things were then and how they are now, parenting through the lens of the ages, if you will. Now, whether you're a parent, a kid, or someone who used to be a kid, you'll want to stay tuned as we reminisce about the past, embrace the future, and marvel in the present how things have changed. If you're ready to glance back in time at kids, parenting, and the good old days, you're in the right place. So sit back, relax, and let's take a trip down parenting's memory lane. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I always like to get two sides of the story, and in parenting, I wanted to get a dad's perspective. That's why I invited Casey Palmer, Canadian dad, to the PTAN podcast. Casey had a lot to say, and he has a unique perspective being a millennial raising his two sons in Toronto. Here's our conversation. So welcome to the Parenting Then and Now podcast, Casey. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I am so thrilled to have you here because not only are you a parent like I am, but you are a parent of two little boys,
Yes.
which I'm going to ask you more about. But you're also a millennial, and I love talking to people in different age groups. And I think that you will have a very interesting point of view in terms of growing up, how you were raised.
Okay.
How you perceive the world as a millennial and a parent. So tell us a little bit more about your background and what you do. I know you're a very popular dad blogger. Tell us about yourself, Casey.
About myself, my background, and what I do. Okay, I'm Casey Palmer. I run a website called Casey Palmer Canadian Dad at caseypalmer.com because branding, right? I come from a family of Jamaican background. I have, my parents are together, have two younger brothers, and grew up in... Yeah, right, back from Yard. We grew up in Mississauga. I moved over to east side of Toronto when I got married, and now I have my own family with two little boys, and I tend to write and share about their stories all the time right now. My 4-year-old is hilarious in almost the most unintentional way possible.
Which is how they do it, right? They don't plan.
Well, one of his classmates told me that he was like the coolest and funniest kid in school. And I was like, no, we're not having that. No, I am going to bring him down a few pegs immediately.
He's already branding himself, right?
Well, it works for me personally, but we'll talk about that later.
He's watching Dad, yeah.
But and now we're talking about our adventures on my site, and I'm expanding bit by bit. I find 2018 has been a year where I've seen so much more growth and impact about the things I've been doing when I've done a lot of public speaking and starting to see that people are finding value in the stuff I put online.
Yeah, I see you everywhere. Every time I look at my social feeds, Casey's here, Casey's there, Casey's everywhere.
Yeah,
this is awesome.
It's been a busy couple of months. But I've been talking with a lot more people who aren't in the social sphere, in the creator sphere, and finding that, I've heard stories where, this piece of writing inspired me to have like a heart-to-heart with my dad. This piece of writing got me to really reevaluate how I parent. And I was like, oh, okay. I did not realize that people were taking it and really finding themselves in it, which is awesome for me because it shows me that I'm doing something well. So I just kind of, that was a combination. There's a word there that was coming out, and now it's here. Combination of different answers I all gave in that one question you asked, but there you go.
I love that.
I can go with it.
That's really interesting. So, because I think the dad blog sphere is not that big, is it?
No,
what do you think?
It's larger in the States. Everything's bigger in the States.
Right.
So they have maybe, I've seen hundreds who are pretty active. I was at the Dad 2 Summit in New Orleans in the beginning of February, and they had an audience of maybe 300-400 there. Okay. So there's a lot of dad bloggers in the States. In Canada, active, I think there are 24 or less across the country.
Wow, and do you know all of them?
I do know all of them. Yeah, pretty well. Pretty well.
Wow.
It's 2.5 million dads in Canada, according to the last census, and about 25 dad bloggers who are, sharing the message. So it's one for every 100,000, if I did my math right.
You've got a ways to go then.
Yeah.
So you're helping the cause, and you're talking about all kinds of things on your blog. I love it. I've read a lot of your content, and you talk a lot about your family, but you have an interesting background as well. And I guess my curiosity in having you on the show is wanting to know how you, as a millennial, because you're a millennial, how you see not only how you were raised by your parents. You said you grew up in Mississauga, which is just outside of Toronto here in Canada, and how you're raising your two little boys. What do you see are some of the key differences?
My boys can get away with way more than I could.
Really?
In certain ways. I mean, we're talking about Jamaican culture. My parents weren't super strict. They're both lovely people. I love them both, and we have a great relationship now. But yeah, you had spanking was on the table. That was a thing, and we had.
And how do you feel about spanking with your kids?
Last resort. It's very much the last line of defense. If they are misbehaving to the point that I have to get there, then something has gone horribly wrong with the program.
Right.
But it's not off the table. It's just not something I find I have to resort to often. I can usually count down from 5, and by 3, everyone's just like, okay, Dad's gonna do something. Dad's getting serious. Let's calm it down.
Yeah.
But yeah, my parents. I talk a lot about intergenerational growth. I'm going to reference back to all these things I've done this year. But I was doing a talk at the Pape Danforth Library on Wednesday night with the East Enders Against Racism group. So I was doing a talk about the Black Canadian narrative to kind of close off Black History Month. And what I said then is that I'm really big on the idea of intergenerational growth, understanding what I'm able to do today is correlated to all the things that, I've learned from my parents, their parents, and the parents before them. The things they have developed and learned and instilled in the generations that follow make up how I approach things now.
That's really interesting. So you're basically saying that parenting is a cumulative effect, not only in the here and now with the community that you have around you, but it's also a buildup of all of those years of wisdom and trial and error and all that stuff that leads you to where you are today.
Yes, big time.
So your parents thrilled to hear that, or what?
I think so. I mean, there's certain things my parents would have done or approaches they would have had that I don't ascribe to, only because things were different for them than they are for me. My parents worked hard so that I wouldn't have to struggle in the same way. I have a different set of resources, community skills, and things like that come from a lot of the experiences they plunged me into as their eldest son, as their guinea pig, to make sure I could take on as much as possible. So there's certain things that I've changed in how I approach them from the way my parents would have, because, like, for example, 2 working parents, but not in jobs that had a lot of work-life balance.
Okay.
My dad ran a restaurant, so he would be working 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days a week.
Long day.
It's huge. It's massive. And my mom did data entry, so she would just be staring at a screen for like 8-9 hours a day, and then she'd have to rely on daycare programs and her mom, my maternal grandmother, in order to watch us, to make sure that we had somewhere to go, because they're just so busy working to pay the bills and take care of things. So I didn't really, I guess, my childhood was far from tragic, but I know that my parents they weren't able to play the physical presence role they wanted to play when they were raising kids. Right. They had kids, they realized they could provide for them through their efforts, but they couldn't be there to have, a lot of home time with us.
Right. So now, how did that affect you in terms of what you did? So did you have brothers and sisters that you played with? Were you more or less autonomous as a child when you were growing up? Was there a lot of quote unquote protection of your safety? Because, here and now in this year, we talk a lot about helicopter parenting and stranger danger and all of these things that you and I, who are in the parenting community, hear about. So was it the same when you were growing up, or were you more or less
way different,
free-form childhood? I mean, I was.
Yeah, no, totally.
I was running the streets.
It was, I have 2 younger brothers, so I was the eldest of 3. At the same time, I was really autonomous. My brothers and I are very different from each other. So I'd be the one who, if they're outside playing with the neighbors' kids and running around and, disappearing to the park and not coming home till dark on their bikes and things like that, I would do that sometimes, and other times I'd be inside of the age of 11 writing stories, because I took more of an intellectual approach to my hobbies and activities, and I mixed in a lot more physical as I got older, ran track, did rugby, things like that. But I was always trying to keep myself entertained, I guess, at all times, because I knew that, my mom and dad wouldn't be around to like take me out to Disney or whatever else like classmates may be doing. Right. I had to kind of rely on my own wits and skills to keep myself going. So a lot, like even summers were huge for just finding as many books as possible, writing as many things, drawing, keep myself going.
So you were creative. You were using your creative juices and your imagination to kind of build your world around you.
Yeah, before I even recognized what it really was and what I was doing, that's just how I operated to make sure that I filled the space around me both physically and mentally.
Yeah. Now, with your two sons, Casey, do you find that they, they're little too,
yes.
right? Because they're 2, I want to say 2 and 4?
You got it.
Yeah. Okay. So they're little guys. Yes. So obviously they're supervised all the time. But do you find that they find things to play with a lot, or do you find, and I bring this into every conversation that I have with anybody, do you find that technology is a big part of their playtime and their learning?
Yeah.
How do you feel about tech?
They scream bloody murder anytime you turn off a screen on them. Like it's the worst thing ever. Personally, I believe that they have enough around them that they don't need any technology. I prefer to have them play with toys. The older one can like read simple stories to a younger brother and things like that. I prefer for them to just explore the world around them and have an understanding of that rather than rely on, playing shows all the time. That said, I'm not against it. It's just I don't find it entirely necessary. I'm actually a child who, invested 20 years in cartoons and video games and comic books.
Didn't we all?
So, right, I came out okay for
Bugs
it.
Bunny,
I recognize it. But at the same time, I just don't think it has to be the be-all, end-all entertainment device.
And now, so how do you manage that in this world in which we live where everything is digital? I mean, I know with my boys, my youngest two, they're 8 and they're obsessed. They, how me and my husband punish them or threaten them is basically, you're not going on the PS4. You're not going on the PS4 then. No screen time for you. And that actually gets them in line, right? So they're a bit obsessed with the digital. Sure. And I have to admit, I feel a bit guilty because sometimes I'm tired and I think, just play on this. I don't care. Just read. There
is no guilt in that.
Okay, thank you.
If you are tired, if you are worn down, just do what you got to do.
Do what you got.
Survival as a parent is a key thing.
But all joking aside, Casey, so how do you mitigate and manage that? Because we're all pulled, especially you and I, people who work a lot in social media and media. That's kind of our lives, right? Yeah. I mean, we tweet all the time. Yeah. We're on Facebook. We're on social. We're Instagram. We're TV. This, that, whatever. So they see you, I'm sure, because you do a lot of that kind of stuff. They see Daddy with his. I saw you posted the other day with a nice camera, and so now you're taking some nice digital pictures. So they see Daddy, and I'm sure they want to emulate Daddy.
Yes, totally.
And emulating Daddy, therefore, would mean they're going to start doing the social. Yeah. Have they indicated that they're interested in doing that? A, and B, how do you keep that? You kind of keep it within a reasonable range.
Sure. I actually have a really good answer for this.
Oh, so awesome!
Let's go. So a big part of the stance I have on how it comes to the digital realm and how they interact with it is teaching them from the age of, I started teaching Isaiah, the older one, from the age of 3 about personal branding and being a producer versus a consumer. And so I will tell him about the fact that you could sit there and you can just take in TV, Netflix, you could take in, watching things on a screen. Or, let's say you watch it and you get bored of it after 5 minutes. It's because you're watching something that isn't entertaining to you. Yeah. You should go out and create something that you want to watch. And and he's familiar with my cameras. He's familiar with the microphones we have at home and whatnot. So he's starting to build an awareness of how AV equipment works. And I told him, he's like, just sit down and record yourself. Sit down and figure out what it is you want to put together. And as the years go on, what I'm actually trying to do is build them both up in a way so that we can take my dad brand and move it into a family brand.
Wow.
And so they can have their own individual spaces, because what I often find happens is with a lot of parent content creation, children end up being props.
Right.
It's like, here's my child in this clothing. Here's my child playing with this toy, rather than taking their actual opinions and having them
have a
build
voice.
their own space for it, right? So I'm trying to foster that in them to understand that their voice has power and that they should be able to come up with their own ideas and put it together in a way that makes sense to them. And so, yeah, I take it in the approach where there's power to digital, and as long as you use it responsibly and you use it in a way that helps to develop your skills further, it can do things that
I love
are awesome
that.
for you.
You know what I really like about that, Casey, is that you are taking them from being a passive consumer to being a proactive creator.
Yeah.
Right? So, and in that paradigm, I would think you're teaching them about having control over their image, their brand, their, the perceptions that people have about them. I think that's a really important lesson to teach children, especially in this day and age with digital. Right?
We have little understanding of the impacts of what technology is having on our kids, like where they're going to be 10 years from now and whatnot. And I find that there's a lot of fear about technology that comes up, especially when it comes down to cyberbullying and all these other elements that are out there. I also think you can't avoid it forever. Eventually, a kid's going to come to a crossroads where they're going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with that. And if you arm them with enough knowledge of how things work from early on, that they can understand, not everyone's going to like you. You may get mean comments. Things like this may happen. And they understand it from an early age and are able to understand how to navigate around it. I think, hopefully, they'll be better for it. But it's all of it is one huge social experiment. So we'll see.
Right. So hopefully the experiment your hypothesis will be proved right.
That's the hope.
And it'll be a positive outcome, right?
That's definitely the hope. We'll see.
Yes.
I apologize, boys. If you're listening to this 20 years from now, I tried, okay?
You tried, and your dad tried. That's all we can do as parents. You'll learn that when you have your own kids. So I want to ask you, so you had mentioned that you want to make the family brand. So right now you've got Casey Palmer, and you're hoping that maybe in future your kids will come along for the ride on your website.
I'm thinking about 3 years from now.
3 years? Okay.
Yep.
And now what about your wife? Is she going to be kind of behind the scenes? How does she feel about this?
She sees
because she knows you're out there.
Oh, she knows. She's aware. Yeah. She sees the value in it. She's been really good at championing it from the background. She doesn't want to be present in it as a person on screen or anything like that. So she makes the odd appearance here or there if I kind of strong arm her into it, where I'm like, I need my entire family on this one. Come on. But for the most part, I usually leave her alone to figure herself out. That at the same time, it has its impacts. I know that she. It causes her to think a lot about her life and direction she's taking and what she wants to get out of her life, because she's seen how much I've put into building this put together and really going above and beyond to make sure it can be sustainable and that it can have actual meaning and value to it. And so I think she sees all that, and now she's reevaluating the entire idea of having a traditional career in one job for 20, 30 years. So she's like, well, if I can do other things and get more value out of the time I put into something, then why not?
Well, she's right. And I think that kind of leads us back to the whole millennial thing, because I think that, I'm not a millennial. And when I was growing up, it was not atypical for somebody to be in the same job, the same career, even the same company for 20, 30, 40 years, retire, get a nice gold watch, and call it a day, right? That's the way that it was, right? I grew up in the 1970s. And then things shifted in the 80s and 90s. And for people who are millennials, so I guess you would have been born, between the 80s to the 90s.
Something like that. I think that's the range, yeah.
Yeah. You guys have a different perspective on career and life. And I think that there's a lot more acceptance that you're not just one thing.
Right.
None of us are just one thing.
Yeah.
We're many things.
Yep.
And so you're teaching your kids that, which is great. And your wife is getting into the groove. She'll probably eventually see all of the three of you against her and say, okay, well, you know what? I guess I'm just going to have to go with the flow.
I've seen that happen, though, with different families who maybe it was piecemeal, where you have a parent and you have the children, or you have a few different members of the family doing something. Eventually, I think, this holdouts eventually just give up and you know what? I'm just going to join in. If things are going well, this looks like fun. You guys have so much fun doing it. I need to get in on it.
Yeah. So do you find that with your peer group of other parents, other dads, other mothers even, who are within kind of the same age range as you, it's the same kind of attitude? So do you find that they want to, A, pass on the fact that kids can do a number of different things in their lives, that one career isn't the way to go, and B, more specifically for your friends who are maybe bloggers, media people, writers, etc., are they kind of opening the door for their kids as you are with your kids?
I find it pretty unique, actually, in the second group at least, where, we have basically not that many bloggers who are, I guess, working as feverishly as I am and have kids as young as mine. So a lot of the other bloggers I know who I'm close with, especially some local dads and moms, I think their kids almost have more of a established route set up already, where they're just like, okay, I want to be this, I want to do this, these are the sports I like, this is what I like doing. My kids are super malleable still. They still have no real idea of who they are and what their identity is, and I'm just trying to learn what their strengths are and build towards that. So I find it's almost this perfect storm of trying to build things together so that we can see what they make of it in the future. But across other parents, like when I go and drop them off at school and things like that, I think everyone's pretty much on the same page. I don't think again, I think it's because they're so young that no parent has an idea of like, this kid is going to be this when they grow up. But if I can say what any 4-year-old was going to be when they grow up, that I would play the lottery all the time. Psychic powers have to be on point so much. But I think the general idea across most parents these days is they want their kids to be happy, or at least in my peer group. They want their kids to be happy and do well at what they're good at, and then see what goes from there.
Awesome. And on that note, I think we're going to just take a really quick break for a word from our sponsor, and then we will return talking to Casey Palmer, Canadian dad. So we're back talking to Casey Palmer. Casey, thank you again for being here. And before the break, Casey, we were talking about kids and, how millennial parents are raising their children and the values that they're kind of conveying to them. And we kind of touched upon school and education. I wanted to kind of go a little bit further into that in terms of the whole kind of educational structure these days. So we talked a little bit about, that idea of staying within one job, one career your whole life, like we kind of thought about I thought about when I was a kid. Do you think that they're teaching that in school now? What do you think the educational system is doing for our kids in terms of preparing them to have numerous careers throughout their lives? Because I think that's the way that's going to be the norm now, right?
It's so different now. I see it all from afar because I have friends who are teachers and kind of see what's going on in the upper ends of the school system. I think there's a slow growing acceptance that education and the way we see the world needs to be more flexible. When you have, 14-year-olds who are making $1 million off YouTube versus someone who works in a job and takes 20 years to do the same thing. Obviously, right. One of those is going to be far more attractive as an option to kids than the other. And I think what's happening now is that as we, see, certain teachers retire off and you have a new crop of teachers coming in and things like that, and they are more immersed in social and everything going on out there, I think they're taking some of that knowledge and some of that awareness and starting to build it into assignments and starting to build it into the conversations that are happening in schools.
Right.
And I know a lot of what's happening when it comes down to the brands and the different organizations that are online and interacting with kids is that they are putting along the message that, yes, it's a space where there's a lot happening. And you see a lot of the entire awareness of the safety elements of being online, but what's starting to happen and what's starting to trickle in as well is the idea of possibility and talking about these digital hubs where kids can go to a local hub and be able to start experimenting with video, audio, and stuff like that.
Right,
there's a
3D
lot more
printing.
Spaces. The Toronto Public Library, the reference library has a 3D printing space. They have
so awesome
areas where you can go and record your podcast. There's so many more opportunities for kids to go out and at least get a start on their ideas. Any idea a kid has, they can probably activate with next to no capital, just because there's enough out there that will at least give them the resources they need to do it. And I think that's changing the entire idea of what a career is. I think if they're not being taught in school, they'll be taught on the internet. There's an endless resource of like people you can emulate, things you can learn. There's one-on-ones on podcasting and blogging and vlogging and everything else that they can just go and they sit down, have a space, book a time, and at least like just figure it out and learn from their lessons. And by the time they're done school and go to university, they might be in a very different position than the generations before them. We would go to our high school guidance counselor who only knew like 2% of what we're about, kind of try to triage you into something and you hope for the best. Now they'll have this entire portfolio of work and skills they've amassed where they can start to say, oh, well, if I want to do better at this specific skill, I'm going to go into this program that will give me access to A, B, and C.
Right.
So I think we're seeing a huge shift in how people approach developing themselves for careers because they just have so much more they can use to do that than we had in previous generations.
Which I think is amazing. And I kind of say, oh, I wish I had all this stuff at my disposal when I was growing up. But, there's another side of me, Casey, that says, thank God there was no YouTube when I was a teenager, right? I mean, there's a downside to it. What do you see are the downsides to this kind of social and digital milieu in which our kids are living?
Well, I can't remember who said it, but I best saw it explained as the entire idea of you've gone from competing at a local level to competing at a global level. And that has its impacts where before you would have your own worth as I'm good at doing this job. My life is good. I'm happy with my family. Everything's cool. And now it's like I'm good, but not doing as well as like these 3 guys out of South Korea, this girl out of France, and these other 2, like these twins out of Australia. You always have like there can be the entire idea of always not being good enough because, you could always strive for the top spot and being number 1, but that's never lasts.
But do you feel that that's a false premise, though? Because I often think that, you and I both, we're on social a lot. Yeah. I see a lot of Instagram pics. And a lot of those Instagram pics are not spontaneous, candid images. Yeah. They've been posed. They've been taken. There's like 10 pictures that you've taken and you've used one. And you've used all these filters and you've done this and that and whatever. So are we setting up an unrealistic expectation for our kids who think that this is the reality of what life really looks like? Yeah, but really, it's just posed.
Totally. Right? I mean, we could tell them all the time that it's posed and tell them, build awareness for kids of just like, this is reality versus this is what was put together to come up with this one picture. But we have maturity on our side. We have the way to critically look at things and say, you know what, I'm not going to let that faze me because I know that, they put 8 hours of work and putting together this perfect picture. This took 8 minutes and I'm happy with it. And it's like, doing well. Whereas with a lot of kids, and I think everyone can say this from experience from having been one, certain things tend to, you make a big deal about things that an adult would be like, really? Like, really?
You think so?
Is that a real problem? And I think we're setting them up to deal with a lot all at once when it comes down to not being, not enough followers, not enough friends, like commenting on things, all that sort of stuff happening hits them at so much of at a faster pace than ever before, that it's tough. Like, we can try to arm them, but the world is continually growing and expanding, and no one knows where it's going to go. So part of it is there's the entire rules of engagement of getting online and making sure you're safe on there, but there's almost a social component that we need to have more conversation on.
Do you think we should be teaching that in school? Do you think that there should be, even at the elementary levels, having a primer on, basic social, digital, online presence, hygiene, whatever? Do you think that we should start doing that?
Probably. I think we're at a point where there's so many kids with so many devices, hand-me-downs. Like, we now... we're on a 2-year cycle for phones these days, right? Where everyone uses their device, and what often happens with old ones, instead of people selling them, is they go down to younger individuals in the household. So everyone, and with Wi-Fi and everything, everyone can get online at least for a few hours a day, if not all the time. And so I think it's now incumbent upon us to make sure that we are teaching that, here's the online world and here's how to build your sense of how it all works. Because without that, there's a lot out there that we might see as innocuous as adults that can shock children, especially when it comes down to just lifestyle choices, when it comes down to just really shocking images, and not like in a gory or anything, any way kind of that, but it could just be something like someone's stuffing like 8 meatballs in their face, and you're just kind of like, oh, I've never thought of someone doing that. It's like, I wonder if there's more.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing about the internet. I mean, when I grew up, and it was in the 1970s, there was no fear that I was going to see things that my little brain could not handle.
Yeah.
Whereas now, we as parents, it's incumbent upon us to have these really hard discussions with our kids really early to say, you're going to go online and you're going to see stuff, and it might concern you, confuse you, shock you, hurt you, whatever. It might make you have an evocative response, and we want to make sure to prepare you. And I think that sometimes parents are not comfortable, or they're not prepared to have that discussion because they don't know how to process it themselves.
A lot of parents don't keep up with what's happening with new tools and things like that, right?
Right.
And it's not the fault of anyone really on that one. It's just that things are moving so quickly that how do you, be aware of like how does Snapchat work now? How do Instagram stories work now? Now Vero's out. There's always something new happening all the time. And if you're a kid with infinitely more free time to use in order to explore and see what's out there, parents are always at a disadvantage. Like you might be able to see a quick primer. Like I know Amber Mack is really good, for example, at sending out her email newsletter.
She's
that
awesome.
Gives a good overview of what's happening so that if you're not in it and not, if you're not a creator, you're not in the space, at least you have an idea of what's happening out there. Yeah. But outside of tools like that, there's not really a lot to like give parents a one-stop shop to say, okay, this is what your kids are doing right now. Check it out. Make sure you're aware.
And how do we deal with this problem? I mean, because I'm sure there's a lot of parents out there who are thinking, oh, holy smokes, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? What are my kids doing? What are they looking at? How are they Snapchatting? What is this Snapchat thing? What is Vero? I
think it all just goes back to those common set of principles, making sure that you give them an understanding of what the internet has to offer and the good, bad, glad, sad. You want to try and make sure that they're armed with that information and knowledge so that you can say, I can only be around you so often. I can only be there to help guide you through it so often. And I'm hoping that all the stuff we've talked about and that I taught you is giving you enough so that when you do go out there and look at things on the internet, you're ready for it.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And on that note, I think that we're probably done here because I don't think I have any other questions for you.
Okay.
Thank you. So tell us where we can find you online.
Sure. If you go to caseypalmer.com, you'll find links to all my other areas. I am on Twitter under CaseP, CASEP. Also active on Facebook and Instagram. And in the coming weeks, I will be starting up a podcast because I have lots of audio clips I'm not using. So I need to get them somewhere. So people are like, hey, he does stuff other than write words on a screen all the time. And when summer comes along and I can find, a couple hours after bedtime every night, I'm going to make sure I start bolstering up my YouTube again as well. So 2018 is going to be a super busy year with lots of projects coming up. So if you're looking for any meaningful content that will maybe, change how you look at your life, probably hit me up because there's always something there.
Yeah, hit him up and check out his website and his social media feed. He's great. I follow him. He's got lots of good stuff to say and lots of really interesting content on his website. So I will share all of this in the show notes for the PTAN podcast website. And thank you very, very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Well, that was great. What I learned from Casey is that maybe the best way to help your kids is to let them be creative and to engage with social media. Thanks for being on the show, Casey.